The next section talks a little bit about the fact that different organisations face different issues. And in P1, we've seen a variety of different organisations. We've seen banks, we've seen manufacturing organisations, and other not-for-profit centres. So do you think about a lot of the marks in P1 isn't just about your ability to recall the technical information, it's all about application. So to be able to think about what risks a particular organisational type will face. So if you think about public sectors versus private sector companies, public sectors, if you think about how they work, that's going to be effectively government funded. So schools, hospitals. Whereas if you're thinking about the private sector, then we're thinking about shareholder or we're thinking about debt financing. When you're thinking about a public sector company, as a public sector organisation, really you're thinking about the taxpayers who have funded the government, ensuring that they get value for money for the tax that they have paid over. Therefore, when you're thinking about the decisions and the issues that these kind of organisations face, it's going to be all about protecting the users of services whilst weighing up value for money, or VFM for short. Now, in a private sector company, we're not necessarily thinking as taxpayers, we're thinking about the variety of stakeholders. And our biggest risk is the fact of this segregation of ownership issue that we've seen throughout the chapter so far. Now, if you think about the two different issues, as a public sector company, because you're managing value for money, not necessarily profitability, and you're thinking about users of services, you may well make decisions that a private sector company won't make. So you, as a public sector organisation, may make a decision to keep open a very small rural library. Now, financially, if you were purely thinking about profit, it would make no sense. But because you're thinking about value and because you're thinking about the variety of issues that users need to consider, then you may make that decision that for the good of the local community, for the services that that local library provides, it's worth doing. Now, a private sector company may turn around and say, actually, no, it's not worth doing because financially we can't make the numbers stack up. So within P1, always put yourself in the position of the organisation, immerse yourself in that organisation, and think about the language within the organisation as well. That way, the marker will think, absolutely, this person is applying their knowledge. They're not just rote learning and trying to get through P1 in that way. We've seen right from the start that when we're thinking about the idea of governance, we're thinking about stakeholders, not just shareholders. And we're now going to understand a little bit about who some of those stakeholders might be that we need to consider within P1, the interest groups and their interests themselves. Firstly, and we've seen this in P1 exam questions, one of the interest groups may well be a trade union. And if we're thinking about a trade union, again, think about the scenario, think about the industry. In some industries, trade unions are incredibly powerful. The role of the union to make sure that the workforce comply with the organisation and with the law, but also acting as a driving force. Now, as directors, if you want to move your organisation into one direction, if your strategy is moving in that way, by getting your trade unions on side, by liaising with them, negotiating with them, they themselves, then the union, can help push the workforce to where you want them to be. So fundamentally important that you recognise the unions and you work with them as directors. Also do bear in mind that your union, whilst they can unite, can also help your staff to be more committed to you. If you can get the unions on side, then even if the strategy involves redundancies, by working closely with the union, you can minimise the negative aspects within that, help managing change being part and parcel of that process. So it can be a very good, strong group of people. And we've seen Section A questions where you need to consider from the perspective of unions. Most of the P1 questions, however, get you to think from the perspective of the institutional investors. Your institutional investors, the big investors, pension funds, equity funds, etc., all owning large amounts of company shares as part of an investment portfolio that will then be used to provide other people with a source of income. Now, because the institutional investors are very big, traditionally, they have considerable power in the organisation. They own a lot of shares, they have a lot of voting power. And because they are then using that investment to fund other people's income streams, they also are very interested in what the organisation is doing. Now, the reason behind that is that your institutions will have invested in the organisation because they're happy with the degree of risk with the likely degree of return. Once the organisation's directors start to deviate from that, if they want to go and do something a little bit riskier than the institutions are happy with, then the institutions won't be comfortable potentially remaining within that organisation, and they may wish to sell their shares. Now, if they sell their shares, there will be a lot of shares going onto the market, and therefore the share price may well fall. So there are lots of problems within that. Institutional investors as well have, because of their shareholding, the ability to hold meetings. So they can ask the company to hold company meetings. In the UK, just a reminder, it's 10% of the shares. So, why might those shareholders choose to, rather than just waiting for their dividend check, why might they become more active in the business? Partly if reputation is suffering. There have been situations in the UK where shareholders in companies who do things like animal testing have been targeted by protesters. So if a shareholder thinks that reputation is going to suffer, they may well turn around and choose actually not to do this and to get more involved. We talked about risk. If risks start to change and the shareholders aren't happy with that new element of risk for the respective reward, then again they may choose to become more active to try and convince the directors that that is not the right direction. Or if the institutional investors become unhappy with the level of performance, say profitability, dividend funding, etc., again, they may choose to get involved to try and rescue their shareholding, to try and protect their shareholding. And sometimes shareholders get involved if actually things are going well. So if there's been a huge degree of success, then shareholders may wish to become more active to piggyback themselves on that level of success. In a football club, for example, if the football club do very, very well, you'll see lots of shareholders wanting to be involved more and more. When things aren't going quite so well on the pitch, you don't tend to see quite as much as of your shareholders at that time. So think about these groups of parties, and remember you may be asked to, in P1, to write or communicate with those groups of parties, trade unions, institutions. So institutions and unions are one type of stakeholder. And let's talk about some of the other groups of stakeholders that you might face in P1. Starting with the definition of a stakeholder, anyone with an interest in the business or anyone who can influence an organisation. Now that's a very wide definition, anyone. And that itself has problems. And again, in P1, we've had questions where you're asked to identify who stakeholders might be in a particular organisation for a particular strategy. Stakeholder claim, this claim itself is what those stakeholders are after, the demands that the stakeholders are placing on the organisation. So why do we consider stakeholders these days? Why is this the way that we do business under good corporate governance? Well, if you do think about your stakeholders as a group of directors before you make decisions, you're likely to reduce the degree of resistance to the decisions that you're making because you've already thought through, well, what do those who are interested in my business, what are they likely to think, and how can I work with them? On the positive side, because you're now thinking wider than just your shareholders and you're considering your stakeholders, you may increase your pool of investment. Ethical investors may choose to invest in organisations who do think more about stakeholders and not choose to make decisions for those who don't consider the wider groups of people. And again, as we've mentioned already, don't forget the reputational aspect. If you don't look after your stakeholders, so if you don't pay your suppliers appropriately, if you don't give your workers decent working conditions, then your reputation may fall. If you lose your reputation, then it is incredibly difficult to get that amount of reputation back. So that's why and how it's important. When we're thinking about identification of stakeholders, we can categorize stakeholders into 3 different groups. We can think about internal stakeholders, connected stakeholders, and external. Internal stakeholders, no surprises, those within the organisation, so the directors, the shareholders, etc. Connected stakeholders, those with a financial relationship, so banks, institutional investors, customers, suppliers, those who trade with the organisation. And your external stakeholders, effectively anybody else, anybody who's not within the organisation in terms of a director, a manager or staff, or those who have a financial relationship, the providers of finance and the trading partners. Those who are internal and those who are connected, we tend to link together and talk about being primary stakeholders, whereas those who are outside we refer to as secondary. Now, the problem with your secondary stakeholders is that because they are outside your organisation and they are stakeholders because they judge you, you may not actually know who they are. So if you're an organisation working in a local community, well, you might not know who that local community is. You might not know those people, but you will know who your staff are. You will know who your providers of finance are. So those are your secondary stakeholders. Now, as a result of these 3 headings, internal, connected and external, you've now got a big list of stakeholders, lots of different people there. That's not going to help me though, because I can't possibly keep all of those stakeholders happy. So what I've got to try and do is find some way of working out who are the important ones. How can I prioritise this list of stakeholders? The problem comes with the fact that they all think that they are the most important stakeholder. So the shareholders think they're the most important stakeholder, the bank will think they're the most important stakeholder, your staff will think they are the most important stakeholder. So we need to identify an approach which will allow me as the organisation to work out who actually is important here, who am I going to need to work most closely with. When we're thinking about that, again, remember the definition of the stakeholder claims. What do they want from me? Because that way I can work out my key stakeholders, and they're the ones I'm going to have to work closely with. A couple more definitions for you. Wide versus narrow, voluntary versus involuntary. Voluntary stakeholders, first of all. Voluntary stakeholders are stakeholders because they want to be stakeholders, their own free will. Whereas involuntary stakeholders have no choice. They have to be stakeholders, okay, imposed upon them. If I'm an organisation, I want to build a waste recycling plant and I want to put it slap bang in the middle of a populated area, then the people who live in that area are involuntary stakeholders. They probably don't want to be stakeholders, but the fact I want to put my recycling plant right there, they have become involuntary stakeholders. Wide versus narrow. Narrow stakeholders, hugely affected by what I do. The wider they become, the less affected by me that they become as well. So if I am going to try and prioritise these stakeholders, what I need to try and think about is 2 things: interest and power. Interest. How concerned are those stakeholders about me? What kind of claims do they have on me? And power, what can they do? So I've got a kind of a 2x2 grid there in terms of level of power and level of interest. When we're thinking about that then, really as an organisation, I'm going to try and focus on those who have a lot of power and who are very concerned about what I'm doing. I'm going to be less bothered about those with less power or with less interest. And again, you see this in the real world. So you will see that there may well be a very, very important client that you have. Now, if that very, very important client rings up, then we bend over backwards to keep the very important client happy. If it's a much smaller client, then we might not bend quite so far, or we might not be quite so accommodating. This is the same idea. Also, do remember, when we looked at the big organisations, then the institutional investors are likely to have considerable power and a high degree of interest. So those are the ones you need to be keeping sweet. Those are the people you need to be working with as directors in an organisation. On to the theory then. Looking at this understanding of power and interest, let's use the work of Mendelow. Mendelow said if you're trying to understand stakeholders and you're trying to prioritise your stakeholders along those two criteria, that does give you this 2x2 grid. In terms of power and interest then, high power, high interest stakeholders we refer to as my key players. And that's where you're going to find your institutional investors, the big shareholders. And remember, unions, they may well be high power, high interest stakeholders. Not necessarily always, depends on the situation. So you need to apply Mendelow, not just state that these people will always be in this box, because it will depend. Because they are your key players with a high degree of interest and a high amount of power, you have to be working with these people, involving them in the decisions that you make. The next two aren't quite so critically important. They don't have high on both dimensions, either because they don't have power but are highly interested, or because they have power but are not highly interested. For the first box there, box C, those who have a very high degree of interest but a relatively low level of power, they need to know what's going on. Now, the reason they need to know what's going on is because at the moment they don't have power. But if they start to move across, if they start to rattle the people who do have power, like the institutional investors, like the trade unions, then the danger is that their power increases. Now, I've already got to keep involved these people in box A. I don't want any more people hitting into box A because my time as an organisation is being used up now. So with box C, if I consult with them and inform them what's going on, I'm hoping that's going to keep them in their box and not allow them to start riling the people in box A. Similarly, in box B, we've got people who really aren't bothered about me as an organisation, but if they become bothered about me, they have power to do something about it. And again, so what I'm going to do with this box is think about them, think about making sure that I keep them sweet and keep them happy, because again, what I don't want them to do is move up into that box A. I don't want to be too closely on their radar, because otherwise they have power and they'll move into a box A box. Those who don't have power, nor who are that interested in what I do, frankly, there are only so many hours in the day, and as an organisation, I can't possibly keep all of these shareholders happy. So these are the ones that at the moment I'm not going to do too much with. But with Mendelow, we're not saying that you do this and then you leave it. You would need as an organisation to keep reviewing, because different activities that you undertake, different strategies that you pursue may place these stakeholders in different boxes. And what I don't want to happen is box D stakeholders to start moving in either direction. So again, keep an eye on it, but generally not be spending too much time on your low power, low interest stakeholders. Finally, in this section, let's talk about some of the theories behind stakeholders. We've already seen that the modern approach to business is to consider all of the stakeholders in your organisation, not just the shareholders. Now that's important, because if you imagine some of the very large global entities that we've got, if we don't ask them to consider stakeholders, the danger is that they could make decisions that negatively impact other people. And later on, when we look at the areas of ethics, we'll talk about different perspectives that all tie into this understanding of thinking about my stakeholders. Two different types of motivations. The theorists here are Donaldson and Preston. One type of approach is the normative approach. Normative approach is the fact that organisations think about stakeholders because they should, and they know that they should. And they have a drive to do so. They do that because they know it's the right thing to do. Companies like Marks and Spencer's, when they do things like swapping, where you buy something from Marks and Spencer's and you can take back something you already own, Marks and Spencer's can then either give that to Oxfam to sell for charity, or it can go to ragging and Oxfam then shred it and make money selling the rags. It's used by other industries. Now, why do they do that? Well, partly because they feel that there is a motivation to do that. They feel it's the right thing to do. The reason it's the right thing to do? Well, because, Marks and Spencer's believe they have a duty to look after the planet that we're working on. Whereas the other approach is the instrumental approach. With the instrumental approach, what we're actually saying is, fine, I will think about my stakeholders, but only if it helps me in the long run. So I'll do all of the nice stuff if there is an end result for me. So I might, as an organisation, choose to reduce the heating in my organisation. Okay, that sounds good. That sounds like a nice stakeholder thing to do to reduce my impact on the environment. However, there is a benefit to me in doing so. The benefit to me in doing so is that my heating costs fall. If my heating costs fall, my profit rises. Okay, now that's a very instrumental approach. So normative, let's do the right thing because doing the right thing is the right thing to do. The instrumental approach saying, yeah, okay, but what's in it for me? What do I get out of this?